He came home at dawn smelling like her, not cigarettes, not whiskey, not the city. Her, that perfume, the kind that costs more than Alessia's entire first month of nursing school, soaked into the collar of his shirt like he'd pressed himself against something he didn't want to let go of. Vittorio Moretti walked through the door of his Manhattan penthouse at 517A. Hammond didn't even try to be quiet. He never did anymore. Why would he? He owned the building. He owned the block. He owned half the men sleeping in the city below. What he did not expect was silence. Not the soft-breathing silence of a woman and a newborn asleep in the next room. The other kind, the kind that has weight. The bassinet was gone. He stood in the hallway and stared at the empty corner where it had been for 6 weeks and felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years of running New York's most feared criminal organization. He felt afraid. On the kitchen island, beneath the cold glow of the under-cabinet lighting, sat a USB drive and a single folded note. He crossed the room in 4 steps, picked up the note. Read it. You won't find us. My lawyer will contact you. Vittorio Moretti, the man who'd made federal prosecutors cry, who'd buried 3 rivals and attended their funerals, who'd sat across from a sitting senator and made him flinch, stood alone in his 6,000-square-foot penthouse and read those 2 sentences 4 times. Then he plugged in the USB and watched his entire life appear on the screen. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel small, if you've ever smiled across a dinner table at a man while your heart was quietly breaking, then you already know Alessia Romano. And if you've ever had to choose between your own survival and the life you thought you were building, then this story is yours. Hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next, because this story goes places you will not see coming. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to know exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all really started. 14 months before Vittorio found that USB drive, Alessia Romano drove into New York City in a 10-year-old Honda with a cracked dashboard, $4,300 in a checking account, and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from having everything figured out, but from having survived enough to know you can keep surviving. She was 31 years old. She had a nursing degree from Arizona State, 4 years of emergency experience at a trauma center in Phoenix, and a laugh that her coworkers always said could stop a patient from going into shock. She wasn't the kind of woman men wrote poems about. She was the kind of woman who stayed past the end of her shift because someone needed her to, who ate vending machine sandwiches for dinner 3 nights a week and didn't complain about it, who could reset a dislocated shoulder and talk a terrified 18-year-old through the worst night of his life at the same time. She was, in other words, a real person. She'd met Vittorio Moretti at her cousin's engagement party in Scottsdale, one of those events where the champagne is too expensive and the conversations are too loud, and everyone is performing a version of themselves they think the room wants. Vittorio had been standing near the back, slightly removed from the noise, watching the room the way men watch rooms when they're used to being the most dangerous person in them. He was 52, silver at the temples, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. He wore a suit that cost more than Alessia's car, and he wore it like he'd forgotten he had it on. He had looked at her, actually looked at her, not through her the way wealthy men at those kinds of parties usually looked at women who didn't belong to their tax bracket and said, "You look like someone who'd rather be somewhere else." She'd said, "You look like someone who thinks that's a compliment." He'd smiled. Real. Not the performance smile she'd see later, the one he wore for business associates and photographers, and the men he was quietly threatening. This one reached his eyes. That was the moment. Right there. The one she'd go back to 100 times over the next year, turning it over in her hands like a stone she couldn't put down, trying to figure out where the real Vittorio ended and the other one began. Whether the man who smiled at her that night ever existed at all, or whether he was always just the opening move. They'd talked for 3 hours, he'd been, and this was the part that still made her chest ache when she let herself think about it, genuinely curious about her. About the ER, about what it was like to make decisions in seconds that people spent decades recovering from. He'd asked follow-up questions. He'd listened to the answers. He hadn't once looked over her shoulder at someone more important. She'd known he was wealthy. She hadn't known exactly what kind of wealthy. Her cousin had mentioned something vague about real estate and importing, And Alessia had taken it at face value because she wasn't looking for trouble, and because Vittorio had not, in those first 3 hours, felt like trouble. He'd felt like a door opening. They'd spent the next 6 weeks in a long-distance courtship that felt slightly unreal private planes, restaurants where the menu had no prices, a weekend in San Francisco that she'd told herself was irresponsible and gone on anyway. Vittorio had been patient, attentive. He called when he said he would call. He remembered what she'd told him. When she'd had a brutal 48-hour stretch at the hospital, 2 pediatric traumas back to back, the second one they'd lost, he had shown up in Phoenix with food and said almost nothing, just sat with her while she stared at the wall and came back to herself. She'd thought, this is what it looks like when someone actually sees you. She'd married him 4 months after they met, in a small civil ceremony that Vittorio had offered to make large and she'd declined. His associates had given her cautious smiles. His attorney, a quiet man named Gerald Fitch, had suggested she might want to review the prenuptial agreement more carefully, and she had, and it had seemed standard enough that she'd signed it without pushing back, which she would later understand was exactly what Gerald had been hoping for. She'd moved to New York, left the ER, left her apartment, her routines, her independence, the particular texture of a life she'd built herself from nothing. She told herself it was worth it. For the first 4 months it was. The penthouse was on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown that didn't advertise itself anywhere. The staff knew Vittorio by name and Alessia by a description, Mr. Moretti's wife, that felt both protective and slightly diminishing. There were security men who materialized when needed and disappeared when not. There were dinner parties with men whose names she recognized from newspapers and men whose names she recognized from absolutely nowhere, which she came to understand was its own kind of power. Vittorio moved through all of it with a fluid authority that could look, depending on your angle, like confidence or like threat. He was warm to her in those early months. Warm and present, and sometimes almost tender in ways that surprised her. He'd bring her coffee, exactly the way she liked before she'd asked, would reach for her hand in social situations where she was clearly uncomfortable, would actually apologize, when work consumed too much of a week. She wasn't naive enough to think the relationship was simple. She wasn't naive enough to think the money was clean. But she told herself that people were complicated, that the world was complicated, that she was a grown woman who'd made a choice with her eyes open enough. She became pregnant in her 5th month in New York. Vittorio's reaction was she would pick this word carefully, later measured. He said the right things. He kissed her forehead. He made a comment about legacies and continuation that she'd thought at the time was romantic, and later understood was something else entirely. He made a single phone call, turned away from her, and kept his voice low. She'd ignored that. She was good. She'd come to realize at ignoring things that frightened her. By her 3rd month of pregnancy, he was coming home late. Not all the time. That was the thing about it, it wasn't consistent enough to be a clear pattern, which meant she couldn't confront it cleanly. It was 2 nights 1 week, then nothing for 10 days, then 4 nights in a row. He smelled like restaurant food and cigarette smoke, and sometimes something else. Something floral that wasn't her perfume. He gave explanations that were plausible enough to accept if she didn't look at them too hard: a shipment problem, a meeting that ran over, a situation with a business associate in from out of town. She looked at them too hard. At a charity gala in March, one of those events where Manhattan's power class paid $30,000 a table, to feel philanthropic Serena Valenti walked in at 9:15, and the room shifted. Alessia felt it before she saw it. The slight adjustment in posture from the men near the entrance. The particular quality of attention that beautiful women, who know exactly what they are, can generate just by arriving somewhere. Serena was 41, Alessia would later learn. Born in Milan, raised partly in New York, connected to the kind of old money that doesn't need to announce itself. She was the sort of woman who made other women feel slightly blurry, not because she was trying to, but because her focus was so precisely self-contained. She wore black. She wore it like it owed her something. Vittorio had been standing beside Alessia, one hand at the small of her back, making conversation with a man named Crusoe who imported olive oil from Calabria and possibly other things. When Serena entered, Vittorio didn't move, but something in him changed. Alessia felt it through her spine, through the hand that rested against her back, a subtle and involuntary shift in the quality of his attention, like a compass needle finding north. She had glanced up at him. His expression was perfectly composed. That was what frightened her. He was too controlled. He introduced Serena to Alessia 40 minutes later, in passing as an old associate, and watched the two women exchange polite nothings with a stillness that Alessia would spend the next 3 months trying to interpret. She went home that night and threw up. She told herself it was the pregnancy. She was almost certainly not entirely wrong. The receipts started appearing in April. Not literally, Vittorio was careful, and Alessia knew enough about careful men to understand that the obvious mistakes were rarely the ones they made. But she found a restaurant charge on a secondary card she hadn't known about, found it by accident when she was looking for the account number on an insurance document. A dinner for two at a place in the West Village where the tasting menu was $400 a person. On a Tuesday in February, when Vittorio had told her he was in Newark meeting with a Port Authority contact. She put it back where she found it and did not say anything. She started paying attention. She started paying attention the way she paid attention in the ER, systematically, quietly, cataloging information, without yet knowing which data points would matter. She didn't go looking for things exactly. She just stopped looking away. She found a second phone in April. She found it in the pocket of a jacket he'd left on the bedroom chair, felt the rectangular weight of it when she moved the jacket to the closet, and held it in her hands for 30 seconds before putting it back exactly where she'd found it. She didn't need to see what was on it. She already knew. The knowing and the doing anything about it were, she had come to understand, two completely separate problems. She was 7 months pregnant, in a city that wasn't hers, in a marriage to a man who had a criminal organization behind him, a lawyer who'd been chosen to protect his assets, and a prenuptial agreement she'd been too trusting to challenge. She had no job. She had $4,300. That was now approximately $600 because she hadn't needed money and hadn't been saving it. She had, in the most immediate sense, nothing. She had her son. He wasn't born yet, but she already thought of him that way. The particular gravity of him, the kicks at 2 a.m, the way her body had reorganized itself entirely around this new fact. She thought about him constantly. She thought about what kind of life she was going to be able to give him. She thought about what it meant to grow up, watching a father who controlled everything and a mother who accepted it. She thought not like this. She just didn't yet know what the alternative looked like. Her water broke at 36 weeks on a Wednesday morning in May, while Vittorio was where else unavailable. His phone went to voicemail. The security man downstairs, a broad-shouldered Sicilian named Bruno, who was unfailingly polite to Alessia and also clearly reported everything to Vittorio, drove her to the hospital himself while she breathed through contractions in the back seat and refused to cry in front of him. The baby was small, 5 pounds, 3 ounces. He had Vittorio's dark hair and Alessia's nose, and a cry that the nurses said was healthy, but that sounded to Alessia, in her exhausted, terrified state, like something asking for help. She named him Marco. Vittorio arrived 4 hours after the birth. He kissed Alessia's forehead and looked at the baby, with the expression of a man appraising something significant. He said, "He looks strong." He said, "You did well." He held Marco for approximately 90 seconds, then took a phone call in the hallway that lasted 20 minutes. When he came back in, Alessia looked at him from her hospital bed, tired in a way that went past the body, past off the birth, into something much older, and said, "Where were you?" He said, "There was a situation. I handled it." She said, "I needed you." He said, "You had Bruno." She looked at the baby in her arms. She looked at Vittorio. She did not say the thing that rose in her throat, because she was beginning to understand slowly, the way you understand cold when it first begins, before you recognize it as dangerous, that saying things directly to Vittorio Moretti did not accomplish what you might expect. He did not respond to vulnerability the way she had initially believed. Vulnerability, she was learning, was information he filed away and used later. She said, "Okay." He nodded. Took another call. The first 6 weeks at home with Marco were the most exhausting of her life, and the most alone she had felt since she was 22 and broke and building herself from scratch. Vittorio was physically present, perhaps 30% of the time, and emotionally present for maybe a quarter of that. He did not wake for night feedings. He did not change diapers, not once, not ever, not a single time. When Marco cried during one of Vittorio's rare evenings home, he would leave the room, citing a headache or a call, and return when the noise had stopped. He told her, "Once, this is your domain. I provide everything else." She had nodded and thought, "You provide the building. I provide the life inside it." She was running on 4 hours of broken sleep and adrenaline, and something that was beginning, quietly, to harden into something she didn't have a name for yet. She'd stopped trying to reach her friends in Phoenix, as much it was complicated to explain the shape of her life, and she was too tired for complicated. Her cousin called twice, and she sent texts back because she didn't have the energy to perform fine and couldn't afford to perform not fine. She found the folder on a Thursday morning in June. Vittorio had left his laptop open on the kitchen table, which he never did, and which she would later think about as possibly intentional, possibly a test, possibly just the one moment when his careful control slipped. She'd walked past it carrying Marco, who was finally sleeping after a long night, and the screen had been visible, and the folder name had been visible, and she had stopped moving. Custody strategy Fitch, Richard Fitch, Gerald's brother. Another attorney. She stood in the kitchen with her sleeping son against her chest and looked at that folder name for 10 seconds. Then she kept walking. She put Marco in his bassinet. She went back to the kitchen. She photographed the screen with her phone, not opening anything. Just the folder name, the visible file structure around it, the timestamp, and closed the laptop, exactly as she'd found it. Then she washed her face with cold water and sat at the kitchen table and did not allow herself to spiral, because spiraling was a luxury she could not afford. She sat there for 45 minutes, very still, the way she sat in the ER when a situation was bad and getting worse, and the only thing that helped was forcing your brain to slow down and organize. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she didn't know. She thought about what she would need. When Vittorio came home that evening, she made him dinner. She asked about his day with what she hoped sounded like genuine interest. She let him talk about a shipping dispute without tracking the lies in his explanation. She smiled at the right moments. She did not look at the laptop. After he went to bed, she sat with Marco in the dark nursery and made a mental list. Evidence, documentation, a plan, someone she could trust. She didn't have any of those things yet. But she understood, sitting there in the dark at 2 a.m. with her 6-week-old son, warm and breathing against her chest, that the woman she was going to have to become was not the woman she had been when she drove into this city. She was going to have to be smarter than she'd ever been. More patient, more careful. She was going to have to perform normal while quietly dismantling everything. She thought about patients she'd had in the ER, people who came in having survived things that should have killed them, who'd made it through on nothing but instinct and the decision not to stop. She thought about what they had in common. Not strength exactly. Not courage in the dramatic sense. Just the refusal to accept the ending someone else had written for them. "Okay," she said softly. To Marco, to the dark, to herself. Okay. She had no idea yet exactly what she was going to do. She just knew she was going to do something. The night nurse had the next 3 nights off, and for those 72 hours, Alessia ran on pure adrenaline and the particular focus of a woman who has just remembered who she actually is. While Marco slept, she read. She researched. She learned things about prenuptial agreements and asset disclosure and the legal landscape of custody in New York State. She found things that alarmed her. The agreement she'd signed was tilted in ways she hadn't fully understood, and Vittorio's asset structure was complex in ways that suggested someone had spent real time making it difficult to penetrate. She also found the name Matteo Vance. She found it in her own memory. Actually, she'd treated him in the ER in Phoenix almost 2 years before, a man who'd come in with a fractured orbital socket and a laceration across his cheek, and a story about a fall that no one believed. She'd been gentle with him. She'd sat with him after the sutures and asked very quietly if he needed anything else. He'd looked at her for a long moment and said, "I just need to know there are still people in the world who are careful with other people." She'd given him her card. Not standard protocol. She wasn't sure why. Something about the way he held himself careful, like someone who'd learned that the wrong move in the wrong moment had consequences. He'd sent her a message 2 weeks later, thanking her. She'd responded briefly, and that had been the end of it. Except that she'd looked him up out of curiosity and found that he was a defense attorney in New York who'd once been briefly famous for getting an impossible acquittal in a federal case, and who'd then dropped off the radar. She searched him again now. He was still in New York. Still practicing, though quietly. She found 3 reviews of his work from the past 18 months. They were all in similar territory: difficult family law cases, protective orders, situations where women were trying to leave men who had money and lawyers, and the willingness to use both. She wrote the email at 4 in the morning while Marco slept. She deleted it. She rewrote it. She deleted it again. The third version was 4 sentences. She told him who she was. She told him she remembered him from the Phoenix ER. She told him she had a situation that was complicated and possibly dangerous, and that she needed someone who understood that kind of complicated. She did not mention Vittorio by name. She asked if he had capacity to talk. She sent it from a Gmail account she'd created that night on her phone, logged in through a browser she'd never used, while connected to the building's public Wi-Fi rather than their private network, because she'd spent the last 3 days reading about digital security, and now she was paranoid in productive ways. Then she lay down beside Marco and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning. Vittorio's behavior had changed in the last 2 weeks in ways she was still cataloging. He was more attentive, not warmly, but watchfully. He asked where she was going when she mentioned wanting to take Marco for a walk. He made comments, casual sounding, about the building's security system, about how the cameras covered the lobby, about how Bruno was available anytime she needed anything. Each comment individually was plausible. Together they formed a shape. He was keeping track of her, whether he suspected something or whether this was simply his baseline treating the people around him as assets to be monitored. She couldn't entirely determine. But the effect was the same. She felt watched. She felt the particular constriction of being watched, and knowing it, and having to pretend you don't know. She was pretending a lot these days. She was getting better at it. Matteo responded 3 days later, from an encrypted email account, in a message that was 5 sentences long. He remembered her. He was sorry to hear things were difficult. He had learned in his work that difficult and complicated and possibly dangerous used together meant something specific. He had capacity. He was careful. She read it twice, sitting on the floor of Marco's nursery with her back against the wall while the baby slept, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief, exactly. Something more like the first indication that the ground might hold. She wrote back. She told him everything she knew. She told him about the second phone, the folder, the prenuptial agreement, the custody strategy file, the disappearing nights. She told him about the way Vittorio moved through the world, the men who surrounded him, the resources, the legal infrastructure. She told him she had a 6-week-old son and no income, and a sense, growing daily, that whatever Vittorio was planning, he was planning to move soon. Matteo's response took 8 hours and was longer than anything he'd written before. He was direct. The situation was serious, but not without options. There were things she could do. There were things she needed to start doing immediately. Most importantly, she needed to start building a documentation file, anything she could photograph, copy, record, or preserve. She needed to do it carefully. She needed to not get caught. And she needed, he said, to find somewhere to go. She read that last line and felt the full weight of what she was actually thinking about, doing settle into her body like something cold. Not leaving. She'd been using softer language in her own head, planning, preparing, getting her information together. But what Matteo was saying clearly and without softening it was leaving. She was thinking about taking her son and disappearing from the apartment of a man with the resources and the associates and the willingness to find people who didn't want to be found. She sat with that for a long time. Then she thought about the folder on the laptop. Custody strategy. She thought about what it meant that he was already planning that, before she'd done anything, before she'd said a word. He was already building a case, already positioning himself, already preparing to take Marco from her if she became a problem. She hadn't done anything yet, and she was already a problem. She thought about Vittorio's hand at the small of her back at the gala, the compass needle finding north, the way he'd looked at her with exactly the right expression when she'd needed him, and felt, somewhere underneath the correctness of it, the calculation. She thought about what her life looked like in 5 years if she stayed. She thought about what Marco's life looked like. She got up off the nursery floor. She picked up her son. She held him for a while in the dark. "Okay," she said again. "Let's figure it out." She started the next morning. She photographed everything she could get to without raising suspicion. Bank statements she found, While tidying financial documents in the home office, printed emails she discovered in a file folder Vittorio had been careless with. She was methodical. She was slow. She did it over 3 weeks rather than all at once, because doing it all at once was how you made mistakes. She created an email account for Matteo that she accessed only on public Wi-Fi, only from her phone, only when she was outside the building on one of her walks with Marco. She was careful not to establish a pattern in when she went out or which direction she walked. She asked Matteo about Elena Marlowe. He'd mentioned the name in passing, someone who helps in these situations, and she'd filed it away. He was quiet about Marlowe for a week. Then he told her, carefully, that Elena was a private philanthropist who'd been doing this for over a decade, that her network was real and her discretion was absolute, that she didn't leave trails, that Matteo trusted her, and that was not something he said about many people. Alessia sent a message to Elena through an address Matteo provided. Elena responded in 2 hours. Her message was brief and practical, and somehow in its brevity and practicality, more reassuring than anything elaborate would have been. I understand your situation. Let's talk about what you need. What Alessia needed was a way out that Vittorio would not be able to follow. What she needed was time. She almost ran out of it sooner than she expected. She had been in the penthouse one Tuesday afternoon, Marco asleep in the bedroom, when she heard the elevator open and Vittorio's voice, and then another voice, Serena's, and she had moved, fast and quiet, into the hallway, listening. They hadn't known she was home. She'd been supposed to have a doctor's appointment that morning, but Marco had been running a slight fever, and she'd canceled without telling anyone. She stood very still, just inside the bedroom doorway, and listened to Vittorio talk to Serena Valenti in his own kitchen, in his own voice, without the performance he ran for Alessia. She didn't hear everything. She heard enough. She heard Serena say, "When?" She heard Vittorio say, "Soon. But I need to be careful about how it looks." She heard Serena say, "She's going to fight you." She heard Vittorio say, "She doesn't have anything to fight with." He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. She pressed her back against the wall in the bedroom hallway and held her breath and felt the cold, clarifying anger move through her, like something being brought into focus. Not the hot kind of anger, the kind that makes mistakes. The cold kind, the kind that organizes. She heard the elevator open and close. She waited 10 minutes. Then she walked into the kitchen and made coffee. And when Vittorio appeared 20 minutes later, she handed him a cup and asked how his morning had been. He said, "Long." She said, "I'm sorry to hear that." She watched him drink his coffee and thought, "You think I have nothing to fight with? Let's find out." She handed him the coffee and watched him drink it, and thought about how strange it was, how genuinely, deeply strange that two people could stand in the same kitchen, 3 feet apart, and be living in completely different versions of the same moment. Vittorio thought he was standing in his kitchen, drinking coffee made by his wife, in a situation he controlled. Alessia knew she was standing in a countdown. She just hadn't told anyone how far along it was. The next 3 weeks were the most precise work she had ever done in her life, and she had once kept a man alive for 40 minutes with 2 fingers pressed against his femoral artery while waiting for a surgical team. She understood pressure. She understood the particular discipline of not flinching, while everything around you is trying to make you flinch. She built her file methodically, the way she'd been trained to build a patient history, not what you assumed, not what seemed obvious, but what you could actually document. She photographed bank statements when Vittorio left them accessible. She memorized account numbers and wrote them down later. In a notebook she kept inside Marco's diaper bag in a zip pocket that Vittorio had never once opened, because Vittorio had never once changed a diaper. She copied dates, cross-referenced them against the nights he hadn't come home, matched receipts to locations. She was building a map of a life he'd been living parallel to hers, and the map was becoming detailed enough to be useful. She was also watching Vittorio watch her. That was the part that required the most from her. Not the evidence gathering, not the planning, not the 3A. Emails to Matteo from borrowed Wi-Fi with Marco asleep in the carrier against her chest. The hardest part was standing in the same room as a man who was quietly preparing to destroy her life and making her face do absolutely nothing about it. He was good at reading people. She'd known that from the beginning, it was part of what had made him attractive, that particular quality of attention. But attention cuts both ways. And what he was reading now was a woman who'd been ground down by a difficult pregnancy and a difficult birth and a husband who wasn't there. A woman who was tired and possibly brittle. He read exhaustion in her and interpreted it as passivity. He was reading her correctly and drawing the wrong conclusion. She let him. On a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after she'd heard him in the kitchen with Serena, Vittorio told her he had a meeting in Washington and would be back Thursday afternoon. He said it at breakfast, not looking at her, scrolling through his phone with his coffee in his other hand. She said, "Okay, I'll probably take Marco to the park." He looked up at that. "Quick, just for a second. Bruno can go with you," he said. "It's easier. I'm fine, it's easier," he said again, and this time it wasn't a suggestion. She looked at him. He looked back. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. "Sure," she said, "that's fine." He nodded and went back to his phone. She picked up Marco from his bouncer and took him to the nursery and sat in the rocking chair and let herself feel, just for the duration of one slow breath, how much she hated this. The managed exits.
Like surveillance.
Bruno at her elbow reporting back, a shadow that smiled and held doors and told Vittorio exactly where she'd been and for how long. One breath. Then she put it somewhere it wouldn't interfere and started thinking about how to work around it. She'd already told Matteo about Bruno. Matteo had said fine. They'd adjust. There were things she could do with Bruno present that didn't look like anything, and there were things she needed to do without him. They were figuring out the difference. What she needed most right now, Matteo had told her, was an account he couldn't touch. She had a joint account with Vittorio that she was technically authorized to draw from, but anything she moved from it would be visible, and visible was the one thing she couldn't afford. She needed something clean, something that didn't come from him. She'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks. She'd been thinking about Dr. Isabella Cross. Isabella had been Alessia's supervisor in her first 2 years of nursing a physician's assistant in the Phoenix ER, who'd run the department with the particular authority of someone who'd earned every inch of it the hard way. She was 61, direct to the point of bluntness, with a laugh like a car backfiring and a tolerance for nonsense that hovered around 0. She'd mentored Alessia through the bad cases, the ones that stayed with you. She'd also, in a quiet conversation after a particularly brutal night shift, told Alessia enough about her own first marriage to explain why she wore her current husband's name with such specific satisfaction. Alessia called her on a Friday morning while Bruno waited downstairs. She took Marco to the rooftop garden. There was a rooftop garden, maintained by a service that came Tuesdays, empty the rest of the time, and sat in a corner away from the nearest camera's angle and called Isabella on the phone. Isabella answered on the second ring, Alessia Romano, or whatever you're calling yourself now. Same name, Alessia said. Good. I always thought Romano was better anyway. A pause. You sound tired. I'm calling because I need help, Alessia said. Real help. I don't have a lot of time to explain everything, and I need you to not ask me to yet. Isabella was quiet for 3 seconds. That was the thing about Isabella, she didn't fill silence with noise. Okay, she said. I need to be able to receive money that doesn't come from my husband. A small amount, initially. I need it to go somewhere he can't see. Another pause. Shorter. How small? Enough to move, Alessia said. And enough to start over. Isabella said, Where are you? New York. Okay, Alessia heard her exhale. I'm going to give you a name. I want you to write it down. This person does financial consulting for women in transition. She's in New York. She won't ask you anything you don't want to answer, and she won't write down anything that doesn't need writing down. You call her and tell her, I sent you, and she will set up what you need. Alessia wrote the name in the back of the diaper bag notebook. And Alessia, Isabella said, whatever this is, whatever he's done, you're going to be okay. I know that's easy to say. It is easy to say, I know. Her voice was dry and warm at once. I said it to myself every morning for 2 years before it was true. But it gets there. Alessia looked out over the city 43 floors up, all that glass and stone and distance below her, and felt something complicated move through her chest. Not comfort exactly. More like the memory of what it felt like to be a person who didn't need to look over her shoulder every 6 seconds. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. Go call her today. She called her that afternoon. Bruno drove her to a pharmacy 2 blocks away and waited outside, and she used the store's Wi-Fi in the back near the vitamins and called the woman from Isabella's list. The conversation lasted 11 minutes and resulted in an account that existed in a credit union in Westchester, under a set of credentials that contained none of Vittorio Moretti's information and none of his money. It was a beginning. Vittorio came back from Washington Friday morning instead of Thursday afternoon, and he didn't text to tell her, which meant she found out when she heard the elevator open at 10:47 a. While she was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, and 3 months of her own reconstructed financial notes spread across the screen. She closed the laptop in the time it took him to walk from the elevator to the kitchen doorway. He looked at her, at the closed laptop, back at her. "How was Washington?" she said. "Productive." He set his bag down. He was watching her in that particular way, not accusatory, not warm. Calibrating. "What are you working on?" "Just reading," she said. "Marco's asleep. I was trying to catch up on some medical journals." He went to the refrigerator, got water, stood at the counter drinking it and not quite looking away from her. "You look different," he said. Her stomach clenched. "I look exhausted. I've been up since 4, not that." He put the water down. Something else. She let herself look mildly confused, which required taking the fear and pushing it down below where it would show. "I've lost some of the pregnancy weight. Maybe that's it." He looked at her for another second. Then, probably. He picked up his bag and went to the bedroom to change. She sat at the table and did not move until she heard the shower running. Then she opened the laptop, cleared the browsing history, and moved the financial notes to the encrypted folder she'd set up, following a tutorial Matteo had sent her. She closed it again, went to the kitchen, and started making lunch, because standing in the kitchen doing something normal was the best place to be when your hands were shaking, and you couldn't afford for anyone to notice. Serena Valenti appeared at the hospital on a Thursday in late July. Alessia had taken Marco in for a routine weight check, and a follow-up with his pediatrician normal, scheduled. Bruno accompanied, and she was in the waiting area putting Marco back into his carrier when she heard heels on the polished floor and looked up and found Serena standing 6 feet away, looking at her with an expression that had been carefully assembled to look like concern. She was wearing cream. She looked like she'd just come from lunch somewhere that didn't have prices on the menu. "Alessia," she said, "I didn't know you'd be here." Alessia looked at her. She took exactly the amount of time she needed to compose her expression into something neutral and said, "Serena." "This is a surprise." "I have a friend on the board," Serena said. "I come for the quarterly meetings sometimes." She looked at Marco in the carrier. "He's beautiful. How old is he now? 10 weeks. Vittorio must be so proud." Something moved through Alessia that was entirely cold, like being dipped briefly in ice water. She kept her face exactly where it was. "He is," she said. Serena's eyes held hers for a moment. She had very steady eyes, that was the thing about her. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away first. She was a woman who had learned to hold her ground in rooms where men held all the power, and that had given her a particular kind of stillness that Alessia might have respected in a different context. "You know," Serena said, and her voice dropped slightly, lost its social register, and became something more direct. "Vittorio worries about you. He says you've seemed withdrawn since the baby." "I'm tired," Alessia said. "I have a 10-week-old. "Of course." A pause. "He wonders sometimes if you're really managing. Whether you're cut out for this life. It's a difficult thing to adapt to." There it was. Alessia heard it clearly. Under the words, under the concern-shaped packaging. "He wonders if you're managing. He wonders if you're capable." It was a message, not a conversation, delivered in cream, in a hospital waiting room, with a smile that didn't quite reach those steady eyes. He knew something was shifting, and he'd sent someone to assess the damage. She let herself look very briefly like the message had landed. Let her face do something that could be read as uncertainty, as fragility, as the things Serena had come here to confirm. "I'm managing fine," she said quietly, "just fine." Serena nodded. "I'm glad." She reached out and touched Alessia's arm, briefly. Her fingers were cool. "He loves his son. He just wants to make sure Marco is in the best environment." "You understand?" "Completely," Alessia said. Serena held her gaze for one more second, looking for something, Alessia realized. Looking to see what was underneath. Then she smiled, said something warm and meaningless, and walked away on her perfect heels. Alessia watched her go. Then she looked down at Marco, who was watching her face with the intense, unfocused attention of a 10-week-old trying to understand the world. "It's okay," she said softly. though she wasn't sure which of them she was saying it to. She left the hospital, got into the car with Bruno, and sat in the back seat watching the city go by and running through what Serena had just said with the cold, clinical precision she'd developed for exactly this kind of situation. The best environment. That was the phrase. That was the one that mattered. He was already building the argument, not just presenting, testing it. Serena had come to the hospital to see how Alessia responded, whether she'd push back or go quiet or look scared, and to report that back to Vittorio. She was a reconnaissance instrument, which meant his timeline was moving, which meant hers needed to move too. She texted Matteo from the car. 3 words, he's moving sooner. Matteo responded in 12 minutes. How much time do you need? She looked at Marco. She thought about what she had so far, the accounts, the documentation, the files she'd been building for 3 months, the arrangements Matteo had been making quietly with Elena. She thought about what she still didn't have, a physical route, a confirmed destination, a night when Vittorio would be gone long enough. She typed back, 2 weeks, maybe 3. His response was immediate. Tell me when you're ready. She put the phone away. She looked out the window at the city that had never quite felt like hers and thought about the custody strategy folder and social she'd photographed on a Thursday morning that felt like 100 years ago. She doesn't have anything to fight with. She had a folder with 68 photographs, 2 financial accounts he didn't know about, a lawyer who'd survived the kind of damage this world could do to a person and kept going anyway, and a woman named Elena who'd been helping people disappear for over a decade. She was almost ready. She just needed one more thing. She needed what was inside that briefcase. She'd noticed the briefcase dark brown leather, brass combination locks, the kind of bag that communicated seriousness rather than fashion about 2 months ago. Vittorio carried it sometimes, not always. It lived on the top shelf of his home office closet when he wasn't carrying it, behind a row of identical dark suit jackets that she'd never seen him wear. He didn't bring it out often. He'd never opened it in front of her. She had not touched it. The problem with the briefcase was that he was careful about it. In a way, he wasn't careful about everything, which meant whatever was in it was specific and important, which meant she needed to know what it was, and couldn't afford to get caught finding out. She waited. She waited 11 more days, which was the kind of waiting that requires you to keep breathing at a normal rate while your entire nervous system is running a different program underneath. On a Sunday night, Vittorio received a call at 9:30 that changed his posture. She was on the other end of the living room, nominally reading, watching him over the top of her book, with the particular peripheral vision she'd spent 3 months developing. He stood up straighter. His voice, which she couldn't hear clearly, dropped in register. He said 3 things, hung up, and told her he had to go a situation. He said a business emergency, and would be back in the morning. He went to the bedroom. He came back with his coat. He went to the office. She heard the closet door open. She heard the briefcase. She stayed on the couch, book in her lap, and did not look up when he came back through. I'll call you, he said. Be safe, she said. He kissed the top of her head. The gesture had become purely mechanical. She'd noticed, like something he ran to maintain the appearance of normalcy, and he left. She counted to 500. She was not being dramatic. She'd learned that men like Vittorio sometimes came back forgotten phone, forgotten object, a test of what the house looked like when they weren't in it. She counted to 500, and then she got up and went to the office. The briefcase was still there. He'd taken it out and then put it back, which meant whatever he'd needed tonight wasn't in it, or he'd decided not to bring it. She stood in front of the closet and looked at it. The combination locks, 3 digits each, 2 locks. She thought about what she knew about Vittorio and numbers. She thought about his birthday, July 14, 1971. She thought about Marco's birthday. She thought about her own birthday. She thought about dates that mattered to him. She thought about the number he used for his gym locker, which she'd seen him set once and which she'd filed away without knowing why. She tried 714 on both locks. Nothing. She tried 197 on the left and 114 on the right, splitting his birth year. Nothing. She sat back on her heels and thought. She thought about what Vittorio actually cared about. Not her, not Marco, not in the way that would make a date feel significant. He cared about money and territory, and the appearance of dominance. She thought about the first number she'd ever seen him say, with something that approached pride. An address. The block in Brooklyn, where his father had run his first operation, where Vittorio had grown up watching a man build something from violence and patience. He'd mentioned it once, in those early months, with a kind of reverence she hadn't understood then. He'd said the address like it was a foundation stone. She tried 273 on the left lock. It clicked open. Her hands were completely steady. She noted that with a distant kind of interest, the adrenaline was there. She could feel her heartbeat, but her hands were doing what she told them. 3 years of emergency medicine. It built something in you. She tried 273 on the right lock. Nothing. She tried 619. Nothing. She tried 846. Nothing. She thought about what else he'd said that night. The street number was 273. The cross street was on Flatbush. Flatbush she tried 358, the old Brooklyn area code prefix. Nothing. She sat with the briefcase in her lap for another 60 seconds, thinking. She tried 919, the number she'd heard him use once, for what she'd assumed was a security code. The right lock clicked. She opened the briefcase. Inside were 4 folders, a phone she'd never seen, and a small thumb drive. She did not touch the phone. She photographed the thumb drive. Then she opened the first folder. It was the custody strategy. Not the thin version she'd seen on the laptop that had been a summary, a working document. This was the full file. 43 pages with her name on them, with Marco's name on them, with assessments of her fitness as a parent, with references to her history of impulsive decisions. She interpreted that as marrying him, and a section titled Financial Dependency Assessment that made her sit very still and breathe very carefully for almost a minute. He was going to argue that she had no independent financial capacity, that her nursing license had lapsed in New York because she hadn't transferred it. True, she hadn't, because he'd moved too fast and then discouraged it, and that she had no employment history in the state. He was going to argue that Marco's primary attachment was to the home environment Vittorio provided. He was going to argue, in the language of family law, that she was an unfit guardian. She photographed every page. She photographed the outside of the second folder, which was a set of what looked like character reference letters. She didn't have time to read them fully, but she caught names. Caught enough to understand that he'd been assembling support from people she'd met at his events, people she'd thought of as neutral. She closed the briefcase. She reset the locks to the position they'd been in. She placed it back on the shelf exactly as it had been, with the handle facing the same direction, the same distance from the left side of the shelf, and she left the office and went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. She drank the whole thing standing at the sink. Then she went to check on Marco, and then she sat on the floor beside his bassinet and did what she hadn't let herself do in 3 months of controlled, careful, methodical preparation. She cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a few minutes of it, quiet and specific, the kind of crying that isn't grief so much as the release of something that's been held too long in muscles that aren't built for it. Unfit guardian. He'd written those words about her. About the woman who'd driven herself to the hospital in labor while he was unreachable. About the woman who'd been running on 4 hours of sleep and doing it alone and doing it well. He'd sat across the dinner table from her and smiled and said the right things, and simultaneously assembled a 43-page argument for why she should be removed from her son's life. She wiped her face. She picked up her phone and she sent Matteo a message, "I need to move in 10 days. Is Elena ready?" The response came back in 8 minutes, "Elena is ready." "Are you?" She looked at Marco sleeping, at the gentle rise and fall of his chest, at his small, specific face. She thought about the 43 pages. She typed yes. She sent it. She put the phone away and picked up Marco, even though he was sleeping, even though she was supposed to let him sleep, because she needed to hold him. He stirred and made a small sound and settled against her chest without waking. And she stood in the dark nursery and thought about the next 10 days with the clean focus of someone who has already made the decision and is only waiting for the right moment. The moment tried to come early. 2 days later, she was in the nursery folding laundry when she heard Vittorio stop in the doorway. He did that sometimes now appeared in doorways and stood there, saying nothing for a second or two, which she'd interpreted initially as tiredness and now understood as something else. Monitoring. Checking. She didn't look up from the folding. There's a drawer in here, with some of the baby things missing, he said. Her hands kept moving, fold smooth, stack I reorganized, she said. The onesies were in the wrong drawer. I moved them to the top one. Silence. She finally looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, not suspicious exactly. More like a man staring at something that doesn't quite resolve, that keeps refusing to come into focus the way he wants it to. You reorganized, he said. The sizing system was confusing, she said. Newborn and 0 to 3 were in the same drawer. He looked at the dresser. He looked at her. His eyes moved to the bag on the chair, the diaper bag, always present, always packed, because babies require a great deal of gear, and she'd trained him over 4 months to find it normal, invisible, background. Can you have Bruno bring the car around tomorrow? He said finally. I need you to attend a lunch. Of course, she said. He left. She stood at the dresser with her hand flat on a folded onesie and counted her heartbeats until they came back down to something workable. He'd seen something. He hadn't been able to name it, but he'd seen something, and she was now operating on 8 days instead of 10, and the margin had just gotten thin enough that she could feel it. She did not change her expression for the rest of the day. That night, after Vittorio was asleep, she sat in the bathroom with the faucet running and opened the encrypted folder on her phone and went through every document she had, every photograph, every piece of evidence she'd assembled over 3 months of patience and fear, and the specific kind of discipline that doesn't have a name, because it's not heroism, it's just survival wearing a careful face. She had enough. She could not afford to wait for more. She emailed Matteo. 7 days, she wrote. I need the route confirmed by Thursday. And I need Elena to know the timeline is locked. He replied in 20 minutes, confirmed. I'll send the details tomorrow. Don't acknowledge receipt in writing. Just respond to the code word if you're still clear. She sent back a single word. Clear, she turned off the faucet. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, the face she'd been maintaining for 4 months, the face that said tired but fine, married but managing, here but not going anywhere, and let it go. Just briefly, just for the second she was alone. She looked exhausted. She looked frightened. She also looked like someone who had already decided, and Alessia had learned, over 31 years, and 1 emergency room and 1 very bad marriage, that there is a particular kind of calm that lives on the other side of a real decision. She turned off the bathroom light. She went to check on Marco. She thought 7 days. Whatever Vittorio was preparing, whatever he'd been quietly building in those 43 pages with her name on them, he was going to have to finish building it without her in the room. Because in 7 days, if everything held, if the route stayed clean, and Elena's car was where Matteo said it would be, and the storm that was forecast for Wednesday hit the way the weather service said it would, she was going to walk through those penthouse doors, and she was not going to come back. She stood over Marco's bassinet in the dark. 7 days, she whispered. He slept. Outside, 43 floors below, the city moved the way it always moved, loud and indifferent, and full of people making decisions that would change everything. She went back to bed. She lay down beside a man who was planning to take her son. And she closed her eyes and made herself breathe slowly, and thought about 7 days, and thought about Oregon, and thought about Marco's face in sunlight, somewhere far from this building, somewhere that didn't have cameras in the lobby, and a man named Bruno keeping quiet count of which direction she walked. She almost had it. She just needed the storm. 7 days became 6, and then 5, and Alessia moved through each one like a woman walking across ice, deliberate, weight distributed, nothing sudden. She stopped sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. Not because Marco needed her, though he did, but because her brain refused to shut down completely, refused to stop running the route, the timing, the variables. She'd lie in the dark beside Vittorio and stare at the ceiling and go through it the way she used to go through critical procedures before executing them step by step, in order, accounting for the places where things could go wrong. There were a lot of places things could go wrong. She'd memorized the camera positions in the lobby. There were 4. 2 covered the elevator bank, 1 covered the main entrance, 1 swept the desk. Bruno worked the morning shift 7 to 3, which meant he'd be at the desk when she needed to leave, which was not ideal, but Matteo had said Elena's window was early morning, and early morning was what it was. She'd packed the bag 3 days ago. Small, deliberate. 1 change of clothes for herself, 3 days of essentials for Marco, the documentation folder. The two phones, the old one she'd leave behind, and the new prepaid one Mateo had mailed to a pharmacy address she'd established for exactly this purpose. The bag lived at the bottom of the closet behind a garment bag containing a dress she'd worn once to one of Vittorio's events and hadn't touched since. He'd never opened that closet. She'd verified this by placing a single thread across the zipper of the garment bag 3 days running. The thread was undisturbed. On day 4, Vittorio told her he had a meeting Tuesday night that would run late. She said, okay. She thought Tuesday is the storm. The weather service had updated the forecast twice. The storm was now projected to make landfall around 3 a.m. Wednesday, with the heaviest rain hitting Manhattan between 4 and 7 in the morning. High winds, reduced visibility. The kind of morning where the city hunches its shoulders and moves differently, where people keep their heads down, where a woman pushing a stroller through the rain is not a thing anyone looks at twice. Tuesday night, Vittorio out late, Wednesday at dawn. She texted Matteo the single word they'd agreed on. Storm. He responded in 4 minutes with 3 numbers, the address where Elena would be parked. She memorized it, deleted the message, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the city and feeling the particular quality of a plan that has moved from preparation into inevitability. This was happening. Wednesday morning, before light. She spent Tuesday in a state of performed normalcy so complete, it frightened her a little, the way any skill frightens you when it becomes too easy. She made breakfast. She talked to Bruno about the heat, which was brutal for late August. She took Marco to the rooftop garden and sat in the corner away from the cameras and let him feel the suns on his face and thought about Oregon, about what sun would feel like somewhere that wasn't this building. She didn't let herself think too far ahead. She'd learned that. Too far ahead and the fear got structural, got into the load-bearing parts of her focus. She kept herself in Tuesday, in each individual hour of Tuesday, in the specific and manageable present. Vittorio left at 7 in the evening. He kissed the top of her head. He said, "Don't wait up," she said. "I never do." He looked at her for a half second with something that might have been amusement or might have been assessment. Then he left. She listened to the elevator descend. She waited 40 minutes longer than she needed to, longer than she'd planned, because something in her kept saying, "Not yet, not yet, 1 more minute," and then she went to the bedroom closet and took out the bag. She checked everything. She did it slowly, item by item, the way she would have checked a crash cart before a resuscitation. You don't rush a crash cart. You do it right or you do it wrong, and wrong has a specific kind of cost. Documents. Check phones. Check Marco's things. Check the folder with 68 photographs and 3 months of documented evidence. Check. She zipped the bag and put it back behind the garment bag. She went to Marco's room and sat with him until he fell asleep, which took longer than usual because he was going through a phase where he wanted her face visible when his eyes closed, wanted the reassurance of her specific presence, and she gave it to him without rushing because she was not going to rush this part. She lay down at 10:30. She set a mental alarm for 4 a.m. and she closed her eyes and did what she'd trained herself to do in the break room of the Phoenix ER. During double shifts, not sleep exactly, but a suspension, a controlled rest that kept one part of her brain ticking quietly at the surface. She heard Vittorio come in at 12:47. She heard him move through the apartment, heard water running, heard him stop outside the nursery door. She tracked him by sound, every footstep, the particular weight of him, and then move on. She heard him get into bed. She listened to his breathing slow. She waited another 40 minutes. Then she got up. She moved through the penthouse in the dark without turning on a single light, because she'd walked this route 100 times in daylight and 20 times in dark, specifically to know where every piece of furniture was, where every floorboard had give, which path from the nursery to the front door covered the most ground with the fewest sounds. She lifted Marco from his bassinet. He stirred, made a small sound. She pressed him against her chest, and he settled, and she stood perfectly still for 30 seconds, just to be sure, just to listen, just to confirm that the breathing from the bedroom had not changed. It hadn't. She took the bag from the closet. She went to the kitchen island. She placed the USB drive she'd prepared, the one with everything on it, the affair, the financial schemes, the custody strategy, all 68 photographs organized into clean, labeled folders beside the single folded note she'd written 2 nights ago in the bathroom with the faucet running. She looked at them. Two objects on a marble counter. The smallest amount of space for that much weight. She put on Marco's carrier. She settled him into it. She picked up the bag. She went to the door. She put her hand on the handle. And then her phone buzzed. She froze. The phone, the new prepaid, the one only Matteo had the number for, buzzed twice in her coat pocket. At 4:17 in the morning, she pulled it out. A text from Matteo's number, 5 words. Don't come down. Go back. She stood at the door of the penthouse with her son strapped to her chest and her bag in her hand, and read those 5 words 3 times, and felt the bottom drop out of everything she had built. She typed back what happened. The response took 90 seconds, which was the longest 90 seconds of her life. Bruno called someone. They're watching the lobby. Get back inside. Don't let him know you moved. She stood there for 4 full seconds. She counted them. She had to count something, and then she made herself turn around. She made herself walk back through the dark apartment, back to the nursery, back to the bassinet. She settled Marco back into it with hands that were shaking now, actually shaking, not the contained adrenaline tremor she'd managed before, but something deeper, something that went past the body's usual management systems. She put the bag back behind the garment bag. She went to the kitchen and removed the USB and the note and put them in the pocket of her robe and stood at the counter for a moment breathing. Then she went back to bed. She lay down beside Vittorio in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the entire saw structure of the last 3 months sit on her chest like something physical. He knew. He didn't know exactly what she was doing. But Bruno had seen something or noticed something or been told to watch for something specific and had made a call. And now there were people in the lobby at 4 in the morning, waiting for a woman with a bag and a baby. He knew she was going to run. She lay in the dark and did not sleep and did not cry and did not move. And when Vittorio's alarm went off at 7, she was in the kitchen making coffee. And when he came in, she handed him a cup and he said, "You're up early." And she said, "Marco had a rough night." And he said, and drank his coffee. She watched his face. He was watching hers. They ate breakfast like that, 2 people watching each other's faces from behind expressions that gave nothing away, and she thought about the lobby and the note in her robe pocket and the fact that the bag was behind the garment bag. In a closet he'd never opened and thought, not yet. Not yet caught, not yet finished. But close. She was very close to finished. The text from Matteo came at 9:15 while Vittorio was in his office, and Bruno was downstairs and Marco was asleep. She was on the rooftop again. Corner position, and she read it twice. "We have a problem bigger than the lobby. Call me on the prepaid." "Now," she called. Matteo answered on the first ring, which he never did, which told her everything about the size of what was coming, before he said a single word. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for 2 seconds. Not the calculating quiet, not the let me phrase this carefully quiet. The other kind. The kind that precedes something, that doesn't have a gentle version. "The financial account," he said. "The one in Westchester." She felt cold. "What about it?" "It was flagged this morning." "Not by the credit union, by a private monitoring service." A pause. "Alessia, he has a financial surveillance operation that tracks accounts opened in New York under names cross-referenced against his household." She said nothing. "He doesn't know it's yours yet," Matteo said quickly. The flag came up on a credentialing mismatch. The way the account was set up didn't trip the automatic link. But someone is going to look at it manually, and when they do, they're going to find the connection to the consulting contact. And from there, how long, she said? Days. Maybe less, depending on who's looking and how thorough they are. She sat down on the rooftop bench. The August heat was already building, and the city noise came up from below, and she sat in the middle of all of it and felt the specific texture of 3 months of careful work beginning to come apart at the seams. "The lobby," she said. "Bruno. The financial account. He's been closing the exits, yes. How long has he been doing this?" Another pause. Shorter. "The lobby surveillance started 4 days ago," Matteo said. "The financial monitoring that's been running for at least 6 months. Possibly longer. 6 months. He'd been monitoring potential escape routes since before she'd started planning. Before she'd even known she needed to plan. He'd been building the walls while she'd been deciding whether to look for the door. "Matteo," she said, and she was proud of how level her voice was. "Is Elena still available?" "Yes, but not through the original route." "What do we have?" She heard him exhale. She heard paper moving, which meant he was working from notes, which meant he'd already been working on this since before he called her. There's a service entrance, he said. Northeast corner of the building, accessible from the parking structure through a connecting corridor. Trash collection, maintenance. The camera coverage there is a pause papers again, partial. One camera, fixed position, covering the exterior door to the street, but not the interior corridor. Who has access to that corridor? Building staff. Another pause. Any resident who requests a maintenance access card, which requires identification and building authorization. Which I have, she said, which you have. But requesting the card creates a record, and if he's monitoring, he won't be monitoring maintenance requests, she said, because she knew something about Vittorio that Matteo didn't, something she'd observed over 14 months of watching him operate. Vittorio controlled the things he could see, the exits he could visualize. The lobby, the elevator, the front door, those were his domain because they were the obvious ones, the places a person obviously left through. The maintenance corridor was invisible to him because it was beneath consideration. Men like Vittorio didn't spend time thinking about service corridors. Can you get me the card without going through building management directly? She said. The building supervisor owes me a conversation, Matteo said carefully. I can make that happen by end of day. But Alessia, if this goes wrong. I know, she said, it can't go wrong. That's not what I was going to say. His voice had changed. It had the particular quality it got sometimes, the quality that reminded her he wasn't just a legal instrument, that he was a person who'd been through something and had come out the other side with a very clear understanding of what damage looked like. I was going to say that if this goes wrong, you still have the documentation. Can't make that disappear. Whatever happens with the exit, you have what you gathered. That doesn't go away. She looked out over the city rooftops. Get me the card, she said. She went downstairs. She folded laundry. She made lunch. She played with Marco on the floor of the nursery and watched him look at his own hands with the profound concentration of a person discovering something genuinely new and thought about service corridors and camera. Angles in a storm that was still 40 hours away. Vittorio came home at 3. He came home at 3, which he almost never did. He worked until 6, 7, sometimes later. 3 in the afternoon was she registered it immediately, filed it, kept her face doing nothing. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her. Sit down, he said. She sat. She put Marco's teething ring on the table beside her because she'd been holding it and she didn't want to be holding something, didn't want her hands occupied. I want to talk about a trip, he said. She waited. I think it would be good for you and Marco to go to the house in Connecticut for a few weeks. Get out of the city. The air is better. You've seemed, he paused, selecting something stressed. She looked at him, the Connecticut house. She'd been there once, in their first month. A large property on the Sound remote, staffed by 2 people who were Vittorio's gated, with a private road and exactly 1 exit. He was moving her off the board. He was doing it with the language of concern and fresh air. I've been thinking about that, actually, she said. The city has been... She let herself look tired, which was not difficult, because she was absolutely exhausted, a lot. Something moved through his eyes. Satisfaction, she thought. The particular satisfaction of a man whose plan is proceeding. Good, he said. I'll have Bruno arrange it. Thursday. Thursday. The storm was Wednesday. She had 36 hours. She said, that sounds good. She picked up Marco. She went to the nursery. She sat in the rocking chair and held her son and ran the math with the specific, stripped-down clarity that she'd found at the bottom of every crisis she'd ever worked. Not clarity born from confidence, but clarity born from the simple fact that there was no time for anything else. Thursday moved the timeline. Thursday killed the service corridor plan because Matteo hadn't confirmed the card yet. Thursday put her in a car to Connecticut with Bruno and no route, and a property she'd seen once that had 1 exit. She couldn't wait for Wednesday. She had to go tonight. She texted Matteo, 1 line tonight. What's Elena's earliest window? The response took 6 minutes, which meant he was making calls. 2 a.m. Can the corridor work without the card? She thought about it. She thought about the maintenance door, the lock type, the corridor layout, as she'd mentally mapped it from the building schematics she'd looked up on a public library computer 3 weeks ago. Possibly, she wrote back. I need 30 minutes to verify. She put Marco and his bouncer in the nursery. She went to the front door of the penthouse and turned right past the elevator bank to the door marked staff. She'd never used it. She'd always assumed it was for the building's service staff and that it required a separate credential. She pushed it gently. It opened. She stood in the dim corridor on the other side, concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, the particular smell of a building's mechanical infrastructure, and felt something she could only describe as the ground shifting under her feet. Except in the good direction, like something that had been tilted, was briefly leveling out. It was unlocked. Not fully open, it had a latch that required a handle from the inside, which meant it could be exited without a card. The card was for entry, not exit. She let it close. She went back to the nursery. She picked up Marco and sat with him and typed, "No card needed for exit. Service corridor from 43 to parking level is accessible. I need Elena at the Northeast Street exit at 2:15. The response came back in 3 minutes, confirmed. She'll be there. She had 7 hours. She held Marco and thought about 7 hours, and thought about Vittorio sitting in his office right now, probably satisfied with the Connecticut plan, probably thinking he had until Thursday, thinking he'd outmaneuvered her, and she felt something that she didn't have a precise name for, something between grief and anger, and the very specific exhaustion of a person who has been careful for so long that careful has become a kind of cage. She thought, one more night. She needed to get through dinner. She needed to get through the evening. She needed to perform for the last time the version of herself that Vittorio believed she was tired, compliant, going nowhere. She went to the kitchen and started making dinner. She made his coffee exactly how he liked it, and she set the table, and she fed Marco his bottle and put him down, and came back to the kitchen and finished cooking. And when Vittorio emerged from his office at 6:30, she was standing at the stove, and she turned and smiled and said, "Dinner's almost ready." He sat at the table. He picked up his phone. She plated the food and brought it over, and sat across from him, and they ate, and he talked about the Connecticut house, about the staff who'd air it out, about how good the sea air would be for Marco. And she made the sounds at the right moments, and asked a question about the property that sounded like genuine curiosity, and he answered it, and she listened. And the whole time the bag was in the closet behind the garment bag, and the note was in her robe pocket, and Elena was going to be at the Northeast exit at 2:15. After dinner, she cleaned up. He watched television. She put Marco to bed. She did his whole routine bath, bottle, the specific order of steps that Marco had come to rely on, the sequence that told him the day was ending and the night was safe. She did it slowly, with her full attention, because she was not going to rush this. She was not going to give him a shortened version of it on this night of all nights. He went down at 8:45. She came back to the living room. She sat beside Vittorio on the couch and watched television without seeing any of it, and when he went to bed at 10:30, she said goodnight and stayed up another 20 minutes before following. She lay in the dark. She listened to Vittorio's breathing. She waited. At 12:30, she got up. She moved through the dark apartment with the precision of someone who has rehearsed a thing until rehearsal and execution are the same state. She did not turn on lights. She did not rush. She went to the nursery first and stood over Marco's bassinet and looked at him sleeping and felt the full weight of what she was doing and what she was risking and what the alternative was, Connecticut. One exit, a gate, staff who reported to Vittorio, and she reached down and very gently, very slowly began to lift him. He was warm. He smelled like the lavender wash she used on his hair. He made a small sound when she lifted him. The involuntary protest of a sleeping person disturbed, and she pressed him close and he settled. She stood still. She counted to 60. She went to the closet. She was 3 steps from the front door, bag on her shoulder, Marco in the carrier, when she heard it. The bedroom door. She froze. Vittorio's voice from the dark hallway, Alessia. Not a question, not sleepy. Flat and awake, and something underneath it that she had not heard from him before, not in all the controlled coldness of the last months, not in any of the dinner table performances or the measured cruelties. Fear. He was afraid of what he was about to find. She turned around. He was standing in the hallway in the dark, and he could see her shape, the bag, the carrier, Marco against her chest, and she could see his face, barely, just enough, and what was on it was not anger yet. It was the expression of a man watching something he believed he owned walk out the door. "What are you doing?" he said. She looked at him. She'd thought about this moment. She'd imagined it in a dozen versions, caught at the lobby, caught at the service door, caught somewhere between here and Elena's car. She'd imagined it with Bruno present, with other men present, with Vittorio loud and threatening. She had not imagined it like this, just the two of them, in the dark hallway of the apartment, where she'd tried to build a life, his face doing something complicated, her son asleep against her chest. She said, "I'm leaving." He said, "No, you're not." "Yes," she said, "I am." He took a step toward her. She said, "Don't." He stopped, not because of the word exactly. Because of something in her voice, the quality of it, the thing underneath it that was not the exhausted, managed, performed version of Alessia he'd been reading for months. The thing underneath was different. It was the voice she used in the ER when a situation had moved past the point of negotiation and into the territory of pure, clear action. He heard it. "You're not taking him," Vittorio said. His voice had dropped. It had gone somewhere quiet and precise and dangerous, and some part of her registered that this was the real Vittorio, the one underneath all the surfaces, not the charming man from the engagement party, not the cold husband from the dinner table, but the man who'd built an empire by understanding exactly when a situation required force. "I already have," she said. She turned to the door. "Alessia." His voice cracked on the second syllable. Just slightly. Just enough. She put her hand on the handle. "There are men downstairs," he said. "You won't get through the lobby," she said. And she opened the staff corridor door instead of the front door, and she walked through it, and she let it close behind her. And she stood in the concrete corridor with her son asleep on her chest and the bag on her shoulder, and the sound of the door clicking shut between her and everything she was leaving, and she did not let herself stop moving. The corridor smelled like concrete and metal, and the building's deep infrastructure, and the fluorescent lights buzzed slightly, and her footsteps were too loud even in soft shoes, and Marco slept through all of it, which she took as the only uncomplicated good thing about the last 6 hours. She reached the parking level. She found the northeast corridor. The exterior door had a push bar. She pushed it. Cold air hit her. Rain, not the storm yet, just the leading edge of it, light and misty. She stepped through, and the door closed behind her, and she was outside, on a service alley on the northeast side of the building, and 30 feet away a black SUV sat with its lights off. The back door opened. Elena Marlowe leaned out. 60 years old, gray hair cut short, eyes that had seen everything she needed to see, and retained a precise economy of judgment. She looked at Alessia, at Marco, at the bag. "Get in," she said. Alessia crossed the 30 feet of wet pavement between the door and the SUV, and she climbed in, and Elena pulled the door closed, and the car began to move. She looked through the rain-streaked window at the building 43 floors of glass and stone, and a man who was standing in a dark hallway right now, understanding that she'd found the one exit he hadn't covered. Marco stirred. She put her hand on his back. "It's okay," she said. "We're out." But even as she said it, she felt the absence of something she'd expected: relief, maybe, or the clean feeling of a decision resolved. Instead, there was just the motion of the car and the rain and the understanding, arriving slowly, that out was not the same as safe. Because Vittorio had heard her voice in that hallway. The real voice, the one underneath. And a man who'd spent 30 years reading people for a living was not going to misread what he'd heard. He was going to know, the moment he regained himself, that she hadn't run from him. She'd outmaneuvered him. And that was going to make him something much more dangerous than a husband who'd been left. The SUV moved through the rain toward the highway, and Alessia held her son and watched the city recede, and thought about the USB drive sitting on the marble counter, and the note beside it, and the 43 pages with her name on them, and thought, he's going to open that file, and he's going to know exactly how long I was planning. And then she thought about what came after that. What came after was going to require her to be someone she hadn't fully become yet, not the nurse, not the wife, not the woman who'd been carefully, patiently surviving inside someone else's walls. Someone harder. Someone who didn't need the ground to hold. She looked out at the rain. She was almost that person. She just needed to make it to Oregon first. The SUV hit the highway at 2:41 in the morning, and the rain came with it, not the mist from before, but the real thing now, the front edge of the storm finally arriving, drumming against the roof in waves that came and went with the wind. Elena drove. She didn't talk, which Alessia appreciated. Because talking would have required her to organize her thoughts into language, and her thoughts were not currently organized. They were running parallel tracks at high speed, the immediate track, which was counting miles and monitoring Marco and listening for anything behind them, and the longer track, which was Vittorio, standing in that dark hallway, and what his face had done when she'd turned for the staff door instead of the front door, and what he was doing right now. She made herself focus on the immediate track. Anyone behind us, she said. Not since the bridge, Elena said. Her voice was the same as her eyes, economical, nothing wasted. I've been watching. He'll have people looking. He will, Elena said. That's why we're not going to the airport, and we're not going to any of the routes he'd expect someone to take. She paused. Do you trust me? Alessia looked at Marco, asleep in the infant seat Elena had installed before arrival. She'd thought of that, the car seat, the specific weight class, the angle, and felt something move through her that was not quite trust, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of competence in another person. The ER had taught her to identify it quickly. Yes, she said, then stop tracking the highway signs and try to rest. She didn't rest, but she stopped tracking the signs. Marco slept the whole way to the safe house in New Jersey, which was not Oregon. Oregon was the destination, not the first stop, but a private property owned by someone in Elena's network, a woman named Ruth, who'd done this before, who met them at the door at 4A. M with 2 towels and warm food, and the particular calm of someone for whom 4A. M, arrivals were not unusual. Alessia stood in Ruth's kitchen and ate soup and fed Marco and felt the shaking finally start the full-body delayed response that the adrenaline had been holding off for hours. Her hands trembled around the spoon. She set it down. She pressed her palms flat on the table until it passed. Ruth didn't comment on the shaking. She brought more soup. She showed Alessia the room where they'd sleep. Elena appeared in the doorway at 5A. He filed a missing persons report, she said, not through the regular channel. Through someone in the department he has a relationship with. Alessia looked up. He's calling it a welfare concern, Elena said, saying you've been showing signs of postpartum instability and you've taken the child in a confused state. There it was. The 43 pages already in motion. Not in a courtroom yet, they hadn't reached a courtroom, that was months away, but in the immediate world, in the police world, being used as the weapon he'd built it to be. Signs of postpartum instability. She'd known it was coming. It was in the file. Seeing it deployed in real time was different from knowing it theoretically. The way knowing a bone will break is different from the sound it makes. What does that mean for us right now? She said. It means we move the timeline, Elena said. We can't stay in New Jersey as long as I plan. We need you in a different state, somewhere the report's jurisdictional reach gets complicated, within 36 hours. Oregon, Elena confirmed. Can we drive? Part of it. Then a private charter from a small airstrip in Pennsylvania. Registered to a company name that won't connect to either of us. She looked at Alessia steadily. It's expensive. I have the Westchester account. It was flagged, I know, but there's a second one. Alessia had not told Matteo about the second account. She'd told him about the Westchester one, the one through Isabella's contact. She had not told anyone about the account she'd opened herself, in Hoboken, 4 weeks ago, on a day when she'd told Bruno she was going to a lactation consultant and had instead taken a crosstown bus to a financial services office and spent 45 minutes with a woman named Carol who asked no questions and charged a fee and set up an account in a name that was Alessia's maiden name and a middle name she'd never used. She'd put $1,200 in it. Money she'd taken out over 6 weeks in small amounts from the joint account, 40 here, 60 there. Nothing that would register as a pattern. Everything within the range of normal household spending. $1,200 was not a lot. It was also not nothing. Elena looked at her for a moment. You didn't tell Matteo, she said. No, a pause. Something in Elena's expression shifted, not disapproval, more like revised assessment. Good, she said. They left Ruth's house at 9A. M in a different car, a white sedan registered to a name Alessia didn't recognize. The storm had passed through overnight and left the air washed, clean, and cold for August, the sky a particular shade of gray that felt like something recovering from something. Alessia sat in the back with Marco. She'd fed him and changed him, and he was awake now, alert in the way he got in the mornings, watching the world with his dark eyes and his expression of absolute concentration. and she talked to him quietly, the whole drive not about what was happening, just the running narration she always gave him. This is a tree. This is rain on the window. Look how the light is doing that, because he needed her voice, and she needed the discipline of it, the requirement to keep speaking, keep present, keep functional. Her phone, the prepaid, buzzed at 10:15. Matteo. She answered. He's found the Westchester account, Matteo said. His voice was tight. His attorney sent a motion this morning to freeze any accounts he can link to you. He's moving for an emergency custody hearing. She felt her chest compress. How fast? He's claiming immediate endangerment. If a judge grants the emergency motion, how fast, Matteo? 72 hours. Maybe less if he has the right judge. She looked out the window at the passing gray landscape and did the math. Pennsylvania airstrip. Oregon. Getting there. Getting to Oregon did not resolve a New York emergency custody filing. That was not how it worked. She'd been reading about how it worked for months. Jurisdiction would transfer eventually, but eventually was not now, and now was what mattered. He can't enforce it if I'm not there, she said. He can't enforce physical custody. He can use noncompliance to make you look unstable in the filing. Matteo paused. Which is what he wants. What do I need? I need to file a countermotion. And I need to file it with documentation that preempts his endangerment claim. Everything you've gathered, I need to put it in front of a judge before he gets his emergency hearing. You have the documentation. I have what you sent me. But I need an affidavit from you. Signed, notarized, detailed. It needs to be done today. She looked at Marco. I can't come back to New York. You don't have to. I need you to write it now. On the phone with me. I'll transcribe, I'll prepare the document, I'll get it notarized through a service. But you need to tell me everything, from the beginning, on the record. She'd been prepared to do this. She'd known this was coming. She'd rehearsed it in the Phoenix R way, organized, sequenced, stripped of emotion, not because the emotion wasn't there, but because emotion without organization helps no one. Okay, she said. Are you recording? Yes. Then let's start. She told him everything. She told him from the beginning the engagement party, the prenuptial agreement, the disappearing nights, the gala Serena, the receipt for dinner for two, the second phone, the hospital birth, the 4 hours alone, Bruno driving her while Vittorio was unreachable. She told him about the laptop and the custody strategy folder, and the briefcase and the 43 pages, and the section titled Financial Dependency Assessment. She told him about Serena at the hospital, the welfare concern language, the best environment. She told him about the surveillance, the lobby, Bruno's reports, the financial monitoring system. She told him about the staff corridor and Elena and the drive and the missing persons report filed through a department contact. She told him all of it, and her voice stayed level the whole time, which required more from her than most things she'd ever done. More than the birth, more than the briefcase, more than lying in the dark next to a man who was planning to take her child. It took 40 minutes. At the end, Matteo was quiet for a moment. This is enough, he said. This is more than enough. File it, she said. I'll have it in front of a judge by end of day. She hung up. Marco had fallen asleep again, somewhere during the affidavit. She looked at his face at the specific irreducible fact of him, and felt the exhaustion hit her in a wave that nearly took her sideways. 3 nights of almost no sleep, the adrenaline burning off. The particular aftermath of speaking everything out loud that you've been holding quiet for months. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Then she straightened up and looked out the window and watched Pennsylvania go by. The airstrip was outside a town called Harrington, small private 2 hangars, a runway that looked like it was used primarily for agricultural operations. The plane was a 6-seat Cessna flown by a man named Davo, who said approximately 4 words during the entire interaction, and had the demeanor of someone for whom unusual passengers were entirely unremarkable. They were in the air by 2 p.m. The flight was loud and turbulent over the Appalachians, and Marco screamed for 40 minutes straight, and Alessia held him and walked the tiny aisle and did everything she knew how to do, and eventually he exhausted himself into sleep against her shoulder, and she sat back down and looked out the window at the mountains below and thought, we're moving. We're actually moving. Elena was on her phone the entire flight, speaking quietly. Receiving information Alessia understood, though she couldn't hear specifics over the engine noise. At one point, Elena looked over at her and said, loud enough to carry, he's hired 2 private investigators. New York firms. They're looking for your exit route. They'll find the service corridor, Alessia said. Yes, but they won't find where you went from there. Elena paused. Ruth's house is clean. She's done this before, I know. They'll look at airports, I know. Harrington is not in any system they'd think to search. I know, Alessia said, for the third time, and Elena looked at her with something that might have been the closest she came to warmth. You're good at this, Elena said. I was good at keeping people alive in emergency rooms, Alessia said. Turns out it's the same set of skills. They landed in Oregon at 6:15 Pacific time. A car was waiting different driver, someone from Elena's Western network, a quiet woman in her 50s who drove without being told where to go, which meant Elena had coordinated this leg before takeoff. The house was outside Portland. Not rural exactly, a neighborhood, ordinary houses, the specific American normalcy of a street where families lived and dogs were walked, and no one was monitoring the lobby exits. The house had a fenced yard and a room already set up for an infant and a kitchen where someone had left groceries, and Alessia stood in the living room and looked at all of it and felt the full weight of the last 36 hours sit down in her all at once. Her legs went unreliable. She found the couch. She sat. Elena sat across from her. You need to sleep, Elena said. I know. Matteo will handle the filing. You've done what you can do today. He's going to fight it, Alessia said. The emergency custody motion. He's going to go after me with everything he has, and he is... She stopped. She thought about the empire, the men, the resources, the 30 years of knowing how to make things go the way he wanted them to go. He has a lot. Yes, Elena said, he does. She didn't soften it, which was one of the things Alessia had come to respect about her in the last 24 hours. But you have what you gathered, and you have Matteo. And you have the fact that a judge who sees that custody strategy document is going to have questions that Vittorio cannot answer without incriminating himself further. He'll say, I stole it. You photographed documents in your own home. His attorney will argue. Matteo will counter-argue, Elena said firmly. That's what he does. That's why I sent you to him. She paused. You can't fight this tonight. You can only rest tonight. Alessia looked at Marco in the carrier. He was asleep again. He'd become, in the last 24 hours, the most adaptable traveler she'd ever encountered, which she supposed was what happened when your entire life had been in motion. She said she slept for 4 hours, which was more than she'd slept in 3 days, and woke at 11 p.m. Pacific to Matteo's text, motion filed. Judge reviewing tomorrow morning. Vittorio's attorney already countered with the welfare claim. Hearing set for 9 a.m. Eastern. She read it twice. She typed, What do you need from me? Nothing tonight. Tomorrow, if the judge requests a statement, I'll call you. Otherwise, stay where you are. Don't move. Don't make any transactions. Don't contact anyone who could be monitored. She lay in the dark in the Oregon house and stared at the ceiling and thought about Vittorio at 9 a.m. in a New York courtroom, with his team of attorneys and his 43 pages and his welfare claim. And thought about Matteo, with what she'd built over 3 months, and the affidavit she'd given over the phone in the back of a white sedan driving through New Jersey. She'd done everything she could do. She'd done it well. Whether it was enough was a question that would be answered in a building 3,000 miles away by a person she'd never met. She closed her eyes. She tried to sleep at 2 a.m. The prepaid buzzed. Not Matteo, unknown number. She didn't answer. It buzzed again. She watched it. A text came through Alessia. It's me, I know where you are. She sat up. Her heart was doing something specific, not the adrenaline pattern, which was fast and shallow, but something slower and worse. A deep thud that she felt in her throat. She typed back. Then you know I'm not coming back. The response was immediate. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking you to bring my son back. Whatever else, he's my son. She stared at the screen. She'd expected threats. She'd prepared for threats, legal threats, network threats, the weaponized language of his attorneys. She had not prepared for this, the stripped version. No performance in it, or if there was performance, she couldn't find it right now, and that scared her more than the threats would have. She typed, This goes through Matteo and your attorney. That's the only conversation we're having. A long pause. 40 seconds, she counted. Then you planned this for months. While you were sitting across the table from me, she put the phone down. She picked it up. She typed, Yes, I did. She paused. Then you planned it first. She turned the phone face down. She sat in the dark in Oregon and heard Marco breathing in the next room and felt the full, complicated reality of what she'd done and what she'd left, and the man 3,000 miles away who had been her husband and was now something she didn't have a precise word for. Not enemy exactly. Not stranger. Something worse than either. Someone who'd made her into a person she hadn't known she was capable of being, through the specific method of leaving her no other options. She thought about what Matteo had said. This is enough. This is more than enough. She thought about Isabella. Don't fight him where he's strongest. She thought about Elena. You're good at this. She picked up the phone one more time. Vittorio's last message was still on the screen, unresponded to. She didn't respond. She turned the phone off. She lay back down. She had a hearing in 7 hours. She had 3 months of documentation. She had a lawyer who'd survived what this world could do and kept going. She had a son asleep in the next room who had his father's dark hair and her nose and a right to a life that wasn't built on manipulation and 43 pages designed to erase her. She had all of that. She also had the weight of knowing this was not over. The hearing tomorrow was not the end. It was the next confrontation in a sequence that was going to grind on for months, maybe longer. Through courtrooms and filings and counterfilings, and the slow machinery of a legal system that did not naturally favor the person who'd left with the child, regardless of why. He was going to come at her with everything. She knew this. She was going to have to stand in a different kind of room from the ones she'd survived so far, not a dark corridor, not a service entrance, not a moving car through rain, and hold her ground against a man who'd spent 30 years, making sure things went the way he wanted them to go. She was going to have to be in that room more than she'd been anywhere yet. The night in Oregon was quiet in a way New York never was. No sirens, no city hum, just the sound of her own breathing, and Marco's and somewhere outside a tree moving in a night wind. And she lay in that quiet and thought about what it was going to take. And she thought about the woman she'd been at the engagement party in Scottsdale, and the woman she'd been in the Phoenix ER at 3A. With her hands keeping a man alive, and the woman she'd become in the back corridors of a Manhattan penthouse building, a case out of silence and patience, and the refusal to accept the ending someone else had written for her. She thought, I know how to hold things together under pressure. She thought, I know how to stay in the room. She thought 9 a.m. Eastern. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 days, she actually slept. And in the morning she got up and she fed her son, and she sat in the kitchen of a house in Oregon with a cup of coffee and the prepaid phone and Matteo's number ready, and she waited for the call that would tell her whether what she'd built was going to be enough to hold against the man who'd spent months building, something designed to take everything from her. The phone rang at 9:47. She answered it before the first ring finished. Matteo's voice clipped, controlled, and underneath the control, something that she hadn't heard from him before. The judge reviewed the documentation, he said. She stopped breathing. He denied Vittorio's emergency motion. She put her hand over her mouth. He said the custody strategy document alone raises sufficient questions about the father's intent to warrant a full hearing rather than emergency relief. Matteo paused. Vittorio's attorney is requesting an expedited full hearing. They're going to push hard. They're going to bring everything. I know, she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. It's going to be a fight, Matteo said. I know that too. Are you ready for it? She looked out the kitchen window at the yard, the fenced yard, the ordinary grass, the morning light on a tree she didn't know the name of yet. She thought about a courtroom. She thought about standing in it across from Vittorio Moretti with every piece of what she'd gathered laid out in the open, every photograph, every document, every page of the file he'd built to erase her, turned around and used to show a different judge a different picture. She thought about what was on that USB drive, sitting on his kitchen counter. She thought, he's already seen it. He already knows what I have. Which meant he knew the fight was real. Which meant he was going to treat it like one. Yes, she said. Then let's get to work, Matteo said. She set the coffee down. She picked up a pen and she began. The hearing was set for October 14th, which gave them 6 weeks. 6 weeks felt like nothing, and like forever simultaneously nothing, because Vittorio's legal team was filing motions at a pace that required Matteo to respond to something new nearly every other day, and forever, because Alessia was living in Oregon in a house that was not hers, in a life that was not yet fully built, waiting for a day in a New York courtroom that would determine the shape of everything after. She used the 6 weeks. She was not a person who sat still inside uncertainty. The ER had cured her of that permanently. The understanding that waiting without working was just anxiety with worse posture. So she worked. She went through every document in her file again with Matteo over video calls, every photograph, every piece of evidence, identifying the strongest threads and the weakest ones, the places where Vittorio's attorney would push and where Matteo needed to be ready to push back harder. She also called Isabella, not for strategy, just to talk. Isabella answered the same way she always had, direct, a little dry, deeply present, and they talked for 2 tours on a Tuesday, night while Marco slept and the Oregon rain came down outside, and somewhere in the middle of it, Alessia said, "I keep thinking I should feel more certain about this," and Isabella said, "Certain about what?" And Alessia said that I did the right thing. And Isabella was quiet for a moment and then said, "You got your son out of a building where his father was preparing to use him as a legal instrument. You can feel complicated about that, and it's still right." Alessia thought about that for a long time after they hung up. She thought about what it meant that she still, underneath everything, held some residue of the man she'd married at a civil ceremony in her 3rd month, of knowing him, the man who'd brought her food after 2 pediatric deaths in one shift and sat with her while she came back to herself. That man had been real. She was certain of it. Whatever else Vittorio was, that moment had been real. It was possible to grieve something that had also been dangerous. She let herself do that, in small doses, in the Oregon house at night. Then she went back to work. Matteo filed their counter-documentation in the 2nd week of September. He filed it comprehensively, the affair, documented through photographs and financial records. The custody strategy, every page. The financial monitoring operation Vittorio had been running against potential escape accounts. Bruno's surveillance function. Serena Valenti's hospital visit, and the specific language she'd used, best environment, managing presented as evidence of coordinated intimidation. The missing persons report filed through a police department contact, argued as an abuse of an official channel. He also filed Dr. Isabella Cross as an expert witness on postpartum psychological health and the conditions Alessia had been living under, which preempted Vittorio's central argument before he could fully build it. Vittorio's attorney responded with a filing that was, Matteo told her, one of the more aggressive documents he'd seen in 15 years of family law. It argued that Alessia had engaged in financial deception, document theft, and parental abduction. It presented her departure as evidence of instability. It cited the lapsed nursing license, the lack of New York employment history, and the use of a private network, Elena's network, as evidence of planning that bordered on criminal conspiracy. Alessia read the filing on a Wednesday morning in her kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. She read the phrase parental abduction and felt it land in her chest with the weight it was designed to carry. She set the document down. She picked up her coffee. She drank it cold. She called Matteo. "The abduction language," she said. "It won't hold," he said. "You're Marco's legal parent. There was no custody order in place. He can call it whatever he wants. The legal definition doesn't support it." But a judge hearing it. A judge hearing it alongside the custody strategy document, the financial surveillance operation, and testimony from Isabella Cross about the conditions you were living under is going to have a very specific response, Matteo said. They want the jury of public opinion. We're in a courtroom. She absorbed that. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said back. "Now, the thing I need to tell you about the hearing." She put the cup down. He's bringing Serena a long pause. As a character witness, Matteo said, she's going to testify to Vittorio's fitness as a father and his stability as a household provider. She's also, I think, going to imply that your departure constituted a kind of breakdown. Alessia thought about Serena at the hospital in cream, with her steady eyes and her cool fingers on Alessia's arm. He wonders if you're really managing. "Let her," Alessia said. "You're sure?" The moment Serena Valenti gets on the stand as a character witness for Vittorio's fitness as a father, I want her cross-examined about the restaurant receipts, the second phone, and the specific evening in March when Vittorio was with her while I was in premature labor, driving myself to the hospital with his security man. She paused. Let her testify. Another pause from Matteo's end. Then quietly, "Okay." She flew back to New York on October 12th. Elena arranged it commercial this time, a direct flight under her own name, because she was not hiding anymore. She was not a woman moving through service corridors in the dark. She was a party to a legal proceeding, and she arrived in New York like one. Landing at JFK at 4 in the afternoon, with Marco in a carrier and a rolling bag, and the specific posture of someone who has decided that the act of arriving is itself a statement. Matteo met her at a hotel in Midtown, not near the penthouse. Nowhere near the penthouse, a hotel she'd chosen herself, a functional mid-range place where the staff was indifferent and the rooms were clean and no one knew Vittorio's name. Matteo looked tired. He was carrying it well, but she'd learned to read him over 6 weeks of calls, the way his voice flattened slightly when he was running on insufficient sleep, the particular economy of his words when he was managing, more than he was saying. "How are you?" she said. "Ready," he said. "You?" She looked at him across the hotel room table with Marco on the floor between them, batting at a plastic set of keys with the focused determination of a 7-month-old who has identified an enemy and intends to defeat it. "I've been ready since June," she said. He almost smiled. "I know. They went through everything that night. Every question Vittorio's attorney would ask her on cross-examination. Every place the argument could cut, and where she needed to hold, and where she could give ground without losing anything essential." Matteo was thorough, in a way that was occasionally uncomfortable. He didn't soften the harder questions. He asked them the way opposing counsel would ask them, and Alessia answered them the way she'd answered the affidavit. Level and organized, and with the specific precision of a person who knows their account is accurate because they lived it. At 10 p.m. he closed his notes. "Isabella lands tomorrow morning," he said. "We meet at 8. Hearing is at 9. He stood up. He looked at Marco, who had fallen asleep on the floor with the plastic keys still in his fist, and then at Alessia, and something moved through his expression that was more personal than professional. "You know," he said, "when you sent me that first email from a burner account at 4 in the morning, I almost didn't respond." She looked at him. I'd had a hard couple of years," he said, "after what happened. I wasn't sure I still had capacity for cases like this. The ones that are this size." He paused. "I'm glad I responded." She looked at the man who had spent 6 weeks going to bat for her with everything he had, who had taken her for a email from a nursing mother in a penthouse and turned it into a counter motion that had stopped Vittorio Moretti's emergency filing in its tracks. "So am I," she said. He left. She put Marco to bed. She sat in the hotel chair and looked at the city lights through the window, the same city. The same lights she'd looked at from 43 floors up, while Vittorio sat in his office, and his empire did what empires do, and felt the particular quality of a night before something that will determine what comes after. She wasn't afraid exactly. She was present, fully, completely present in the way that the ER had taught her to be, when everything was on the line, on every sense active, nothing blurred. The kind of consciousness that doesn't leave room for anticipatory fear because it's too busy being exactly where it is. She slept. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected. She didn't know what she'd expected, something more dramatic, maybe, something that matched the size of what was happening inside it. Instead, it was a standard family courtroom, institutional, fluorescent lit, with a judge's bench and 2 tables and a gallery that held perhaps 40 people. Vittorio was already seated when she came in. She saw him before he saw her. He was in a dark suit she recognized, Italian, the kind that cost 3 months of her nursing salary, and he was sitting very straight at his table with his attorney beside him and 2 additional members of the legal team behind him. He looked like what he was, a man with resources, deploying them. Then he turned and saw her. She watched his face do something she hadn't expected. Not coldness, not the calibrated anger she'd braced for. Something that passed through too quickly to name, something that looked, for a fraction of a second, like the man at the engagement party, who'd said you look like someone who'd rather be somewhere else. Then it was gone. His face closed. He turned back to his attorney. She sat down next to Matteo. He leaned over and said quietly, "You ready?" "Yes," she said. The judge was a woman in her mid-50s named Honorable Constance Reeves, and she had the particular quality of authority that comes from having heard a great many people say a great many things and having developed a very accurate sense of which things were true. She entered without ceremony, reviewed the case file for a moment, and looked at both tables, with an expression that communicated efficiently that she was not interested in performance. "We're here on the matter of Moretti versus Romano, regarding the custody arrangement for Marco Moretti. Date of birth May 9th of this year," she said. I've reviewed both parties' preliminary filings. I have questions. Let's start with the documentation. What followed was 4 hours that Alessia would later find difficult to fully reconstruct its sequence, because the experience of it was less linear than she'd expected. It wasn't the drama of television courtrooms, it was slower than that, more methodical, more like surgery than combat. Mateo presented the documentation piece by piece, walked the judge through the timeline, connected the custody strategy document to the financial monitoring to the surveillance function, to the missing persons filing. He was careful, unhurried, and his voice had the flat authority of someone who has prepared for a very long time and knows it. Vittorio's attorney, a man named Halper, who had the contained aggression of a very expensive tool, objected where he could and cross-examined where he couldn't object, and he was good. Alessia could see he was good. Could see where he found the seams in the argument and pushed. He challenged the circumstances under which the documents had been photographed. He challenged the chain of custody. He used the word theft 3 times before Judge Reeves told him she'd heard the characterization and he could move on. Then Alessia took the stand. She'd been deposed before, not often, but she'd given testimony in a medical malpractice case once, 3 years ago in Phoenix, and she'd learned something then that she applied now. The stand is not a place to perform. It is a place to be accurate. Accuracy, delivered without embellishment, is more persuasive than anything else. Mateo walked her through it. The marriage. The pregnancy. The labor. She watched Halper's face when she described calling Vittorio's phone 4 times while driving to the hospital in premature labor and reaching voicemail 4 times. She watched him decide not to challenge it, because challenging it meant asking where Vittorio had been. And where Vittorio had been was a place his attorney did not want examined. She described the custody strategy folder. She described the briefcase. She described Serena at the hospital, the specific language, best environment, and what she understood it to mean. She described the lobby surveillance and Bruno's function and the missing persons report. She said all of it clearly in sequence in the flat American vernacular of someone who is telling you what happened and not asking you to feel anything in particular about it, because the facts were doing that work themselves. Then Halper stood up. He was measured to start. He asked about the prenuptial agreement. He asked about the nursing license. He asked about Elena's network. Can you describe the nature of this organization? And she described it as a private support network for women leaving unsafe domestic situations. And she watched something in the gallery shift when she said unsafe. Then he asked about the departure. Mrs. Moretti. Ms. Romano, she said. A pause. Ms. Romano. You left the marital residence at approximately 2 a.m. with the minor child without notifying the child's father. Yes, you had been planning this departure for approximately 3 months. Yes. During which time you continued to live in the marital home, share meals with your husband, and present yourself as a functioning married couple. Yes. Does that not strike you as a form of deception? She looked at him steadily. I was living in a home where my husband had a 43-page legal strategy designed to remove me from my child's life, she said. I was living under financial surveillance. I had a security man monitoring my movements. I had a woman sent to my son's pediatric appointment to assess my psychological fitness on my husband's behalf. She paused. I was not being deceptive. I was surviving. The gallery was very quiet. Halper moved on. He tried the instability angle, the postpartum language, the stress, the lack of employment in New York. Alessia answered each one carefully, without heat. Yes, she'd been under significant stress. That stress had a specific and documented cause. Yes, her nursing license had lapsed in New York. She had a current Oregon license, filed 3 weeks ago, and a consulting position with a medical technology firm that she'd begin the following month. Halper hadn't known about the consulting position. She watched him recalibrate. Then Isabella Cross took the stand. Isabella was 61 years old and had the posture of someone who had been standing in difficult rooms for a long time and had stopped finding them intimidating. She was qualified as an expert in postpartum psychological health and had 40 minutes on the stand during which she dismantled Vittorio's instability argument with the focused efficiency of someone who had read the 43 pages and taken it personally. She testified about the documented conditions of Alessia's postpartum experience unsupported, isolated, under ongoing psychological pressure from a spouse whose own documentation revealed coercive intent. She testified about what those conditions did to a person and how they manifested. She testified that every behavior Vittorio's team had characterized as instability was consistent with the rational response of a person in an unsafe situation. Halper cross-examined her for 20 minutes and made no visible progress. Then Sura took the stand. She came in the same way she'd entered every room Alessia had seen her enter, with complete self-possession, with the awareness of being looked at and the practiced indifference to it. She was in gray today. She sat down and folded her hands and looked at Halper and prepared to be useful. Halper asked her about Vittorio. She spoke about his dedication to his work, his capacity for loyalty, his pride in his son. She spoke about Alessia in language that was carefully couched, seemed overwhelmed, appeared to struggle. Vittorio expressed concern on multiple occasions, and Alessia sat at her table and listened, and watched Matteo write 2 words on his notepad and underline them. Your turn. Matteo stood up. Ms. Valenti, he said, how long have you known Vittorio Moretti? 11 years, she said. And in what capacity? A pause. Carefully managed. As a business associate and a friend. A close friend. Yes. On February 19th of this year, you had dinner with Vittorio Moretti at a restaurant in the West Village. Is that correct? Another pause. Shorter. She was good, she understood what was happening. She'd had time to prepare, but she'd underestimated the specificity of what Matteo had. I believe so. Yes. February 19th was the night Alessia Romano went into premature labor and delivered Marco Moretti at 36 weeks. The gallery sound was barely audible. A collected intake. Serena did not change her expression. Alessia had to respect that on some cold, separate level. I was not aware. That evening, you were not aware, Matteo said. But Vittorio was. His phone records, which have been submitted as Exhibit 14, show 4 missed calls from his wife, beginning at 10:43 p. He was at dinner with you until 11:15. He paused. He arrived at the hospital at 2:40 a.m. Halper objected. The objection was noted and overruled. Matteo moved to the hospital visit. He asked Serena to confirm she'd visited Marco's pediatric appointment on a Thursday in late July. She confirmed it. He asked her to describe the nature of the visit. She described it as a coincidence. He produced the hospital's visitor log, which showed her arrival 12 minutes after Alessia and Marco, and asked whether it was standard practice for her to attend board meetings at 9:40 in the morning on Thursdays, and whether she could explain why the board's meeting records for that date showed no meeting scheduled. Serena's composure held. It was impressive, but she had run out of room, and the room knew it. I have no further questions, Matteo said. Judge Reeves looked at both tables. She looked at the documentation stack that had accumulated over the course of the day. She looked at Marco's birth record, which had been entered as Exhibit 1, and which showed the attending nurse as the delivery witness, because the father had not been present. She said she would rule the following morning. Alessia and Matteo sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse for an hour after the session ended. Neither of them talked about the hearing. Matteo drank his coffee. Alessia fed Marco a pouch of pureed pears and watched him make his opinion of pureed pears clearly known through facial expression. He's very communicative, Matteo said. He gets it from me, she said. They sat for a while longer in the ordinary noise of the coffee shop, and it felt strange, Alessia thought, and then thought that maybe strange was the wrong word. Earned, maybe. The right to sit somewhere ordinary and drink coffee and not be afraid of what was on the other side of a door. She slept better that night than she had in months. The ruling came at 10:15 the following morning. Judge Reeves read it without preamble. She had reviewed the custody strategy document and found it indicative of premeditated coercive intent on the part of the father. She had reviewed the financial monitoring operation and found it consistent with controlling behavior. She had reviewed the circumstances of Marco's birth and the testimony of the parties and found the father's absence during a medical emergency relevant to the question of parental investment. Full physical and legal custody was awarded to Alessia Romano. Vittorio Moretti was granted supervised visitation to be scheduled through a neutral third-party coordinator, subject to review in 12 months. He was ordered to provide substantial financial support, including restitution for costs incurred during Alessia's departure and resettlement. The judge said one more thing. Looking at both tables with equal steadiness, The court notes that the documentation, in this case, reflects a pattern of behavior that this court finds deeply troubling. I want to be clear that the law does not favor parents who use legal instruments as weapons against the other parent. It favors children. In this case, that means Marco stays with his mother. Halper was already leaning toward Vittorio, speaking quietly. Vittorio was looking at the table in front of him. Not at Halper, not at Alessia, at the table. She watched him for a moment, his hands flat on the surface, his jaw set, his face doing something private and complicated, and she thought about the man who'd sat with her after the bad nights, and the man who'd written 43 pages to take her child, and thought about how sometimes both of those things lived in the same person, and the tragedy of that did not make the second thing acceptable. She looked away. Matteo gathered the documents. His hands were steady and his expression was controlled, and she could see the contained relief in him, the thing underneath the professionalism, and she thought about the 4A. Email she'd sent to a man she'd treated in a Phoenix ER 2 years ago, and about all the ways it could have gone differently. Outside the courthouse, October sunlight fell at a sharp angle across the steps. Elena was there. She'd come, which Alessia hadn't expected. She'd thought Elena would be in New York for other reasons, and would perhaps text. But she was standing at the bottom of the steps in a dark coat, with her gray hair and her economical eyes, and when Alessia came out with Marco in the carrier and Matteo beside her, Elena looked at all of them and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, Elena said. You did good, Elena said. We did good, Alessia said. Elena's mouth moved in something that was the closest she came to a smile. Don't push it. I just drove here. Isabella had flown back to Phoenix that morning, early flight, a procedure she needed to supervise, but she'd sent a text that Alessia had read on the courthouse steps before the session. It said, I know how this goes. You're going to be okay. Now stop being impressive and go be boring for a while. Alessia had laughed. In a courthouse stairwell, before a custody ruling, she had actually laughed. Vittorio appeared on the courthouse steps 20 minutes later. His team was with him. Halper was speaking into a phone. The other attorneys were doing what attorneys do after a loss, managing, recalibrating, already thinking about the 12-month review. Vittorio walked through all of it with the same bearing he always had, the physical authority that years of being the most powerful man in any room had built into his posture. He stopped when he saw her. His team kept moving. For a moment, it was just the two of them on the broad courthouse steps, with the October light and the city noise, and Marco asleep in the carrier against her chest. He looked older than he had in the courtroom, or maybe she was seeing him differently now, without the architecture of threat around him. Just a man in an expensive suit who had lost something and knew it. He said, Alessia, she waited. I want you to know, he said, and then stopped. His jaw worked. She'd never seen him search for words. Before, he'd always had them, always been fluent in the specific language of making situations go the way he wanted. I want you to know I didn't. He stopped again. She looked at him. You planned it from the beginning, he said finally. Not an accusation. Just a statement. Something he was still processing. No, she said. I planned it when you gave me no other option. He looked at Marco, at the sleeping face, the dark hair. Something moved through his expression that she wasn't going to name, because naming it would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend right now. He's going to know me, Vittorio said. It wasn't a question or a threat. It was closer to a request, a stripped-down one. If you follow the order, she said, he'll know you. That's your job now. Follow the order. He looked at her for a long moment. You were braver than I thought, he said. I know, she said. She walked down the rest of the steps. She didn't look back. She had learned, over 14 months of marriage, and 3 months of preparation, and 6 weeks of waiting, and 1 October day in a courtroom, that looking back was not always wisdom. Sometimes looking back was just the habit of a person who hasn't yet fully accepted that the thing behind them is over. She had accepted it. She had accepted it somewhere around the second week in Oregon, when she'd watched Marco find his own feet interesting, and had felt, underneath the exhaustion and the legal anxiety and the fear, a small and genuine thing, not happiness exactly, but the precondition of it. Space. The presence of space where there had been walls. She walked down the steps into the city. Matteo was on her left. Elena was on her right. Marco slept against her chest. 3 months later, she started the consulting position. It was remote-based, with occasional travel, and it used the things she was actually good at the understanding of how emergency care systems worked from the inside. The particular knowledge of a person who'd stood at the center of organized chaos and found its patterns. She was not saving lives directly anymore. She was improving the systems that did. It was not the same thing. It was its own thing. She was good at it. She moved out of Elena's safe house network and into her own apartment in Portland, 3 bedrooms, because Marco was going to need one, and she was going to need an office, and she was choosing her own layout for the first time in over a year. She painted the kitchen herself badly, and it looked imperfect in a way that she was unreasonably pleased with. She transferred her nursing license fully. She didn't go back to the ER. She might someday. She wasn't closing the door, but she wasn't walking through it right now. Vittorio completed his first supervised visitation in December. It was 2 hours at a neutral facility with a coordinator present. Alessia didn't attend, that was the point of the coordinator, but Marco came back pink-cheeked and had fallen asleep in the car before they'd left the parking structure, which the pediatrician said was normal, and which Alessia took as the 8-month-old's verdict on supervised visitation. Fine but tiring. She sat in her kitchen that evening with a glass of wine she'd poured at 7 and still hadn't drunk, and thought about what it meant to share your child with someone you'd had to escape from, and decided it meant exactly what it was: complicated, ongoing, imperfect, the specific weight of a situation that didn't resolve into clean categories. She'd stopped needing clean categories, somewhere around the service corridor. Reality was rarely clean. It was usually just real. She called Isabella. "How'd it go?" Isabella said. "Fine," Alessia said. "Complicated." "Marco?" "Vittorio." According to the coordinator, silence. Yeah, Alessia said. "How do you feel about that?" She thought about it. She thought about the engagement party, the food after the bad shift, the 43 pages. She thought about a man who'd been capable of both, and the specific sadness of that, which was not the same as forgiveness and not the same as its absence. "Like it's his problem," she said finally. Isabella said, "Good." The Healthcare Summit invitation arrived in February. It was a major event, national, well-regarded, the kind of thing that was beginning to matter in the work she was building. The keynote slot was for a panel on integrating emergency care experience into systemic reform, and her name had been put forward by the company's director, who'd been watching what she'd been doing for 4 months and had a specific expression when he talked about it that she'd come to recognize as the precursor to more responsibility. The venue was a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. She almost declined. She sat with the invitation for 3 days, which was longer than she spent on most decisions, and then she called Matteo. "The summit is at the Harrington," she said, "in New York." "I know which summit it is," he said. "Vittorio will probably be there. He attends those events, probably. I'm thinking about going." A pause. "Do you want my legal opinion or my actual opinion?" he said. "The second one." "Go," he said. "You've been building something." She went. She prepared her remarks for 3 weeks. She was not someone who winged presentations. She prepared the way she'd prepared for difficult procedures, thoroughly and specifically, anticipating the hard questions. Her presentation was about the gap between what emergency medicine looked like from the outside and what it required from the people inside it, and about how systemic improvements failed when they ignored the human experience at the center. She'd been working on the ideas for months. The summit was just the room. She arrived in New York on a Wednesday morning. She went to the hotel. She checked in. She stood in the elevator going up to her room and thought about service corridors and the smell of concrete and a press bar on a door at 2 in the morning. And then the elevator opened, and she walked to her room and set down her bag and looked at the city from her window. The same city, different floor. The presentation went well. She knew it went well while it was happening. She could feel the room, the engagement, the particular attention of an audience that is actually listening rather than waiting to respond. She talked for 40 minutes and took questions for 20, and afterwards stood in the conference room, talking to 3 different people who wanted her card. She had cards now. She'd designed them herself. They had her name on them, without any other name beside it. She was standing at the coffee station when she became aware of him. She didn't see him first. She felt the particular quality of attention that she'd become over 14 months, very accurate at detecting the specific weight of Vittorio Moretti's focus, which had its own texture, different from other people's. She turned. He was across the room. Older than at the courthouse, though it had only been 4 months. He looked like 4 months had cost him something. He looked like an empire that was running slightly differently than it used to, like a machine that had lost a part it hadn't known was load-bearing. He crossed the room. She watched him come. He stopped 3 feet away. Standard conversation distance, not aggressive, not intimate. The distance of 2 people who have something specific and difficult between them and know it. Your presentation was good, he said. Thank you. I didn't know you did this kind of work. You didn't ask, she said. He absorbed that. No, I didn't. They stood with the coffee and the conference noise around them, and the city visible through the tall windows and the full weight of what was not being said taking up most of the available air. He looks like you, Vittorio said, around the eyes. He looks like himself, she said. He's getting there. Something moved through Vittorio's face. She let it move. It wasn't hers to manage anymore. Alessia, he said. He stopped. Started differently. I've been seeing someone. A therapist. He said it the way men who have spent their lives in rooms where vulnerability was dangerous say things that are vulnerable carefully, watching for the reaction. She looked at him. Okay, she said, I'm telling you because he stopped again. Seemed to make a decision. Because I want to be someone Marco isn't ashamed of. Eventually, she thought about what to say for a moment, not performing the thought, actually having it. Then keep going, she said. He looked at her. He nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then seemed to decide against it, which she thought was probably the right call. I'll see you at the next visitation, he said. You'll see the coordinator, she said. But yes. He turned and walked back across the room. She watched him go. She thought about the note on the kitchen counter. You won't find us. She thought about Oregon and 2A. M and the push bar on a service door. She thought about what it had cost to build what she'd built and what it had cost to leave what she'd left. And about Marco's face in the morning, the specific and irreducible fact of him, which made most of the cost feel like the kind of price you pay without regretting because the alternative was impossible. She finished her coffee. She collected her bag. She walked out of the conference room into the hotel lobby, and through the lobby to the street, and outside it was March in New York. And cold still, but with the specific quality of cold that means something warmer is coming. The kind of cold that is the last argument of a season that has already lost. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She thought about Isabella's text, go be boring for a while. She thought, yes, she had a flight home at 6. She had a meeting with her director Monday morning about expanding the consulting work. She had a pediatric appointment for Marco on Tuesday and a video call with Matteo on Thursday to review the 12-month plan and a kitchen wall in Portland that she'd painted badly and loved, and no one was monitoring and no one was counting. And the door opened when she turned the handle because she was the one who turned it. She thought about all of that. Then she raised her hand for a cab. She went home.